So why have I come all this way to talk to you about warm-ups? But surely it's coaching 101. Surely we've all learnt, what an effective warm-up is, what a good warm-up is. In high-performance sports, surely we've got to work on those 1%ers. We're always looking for something that makes us a bit unique, for something that's a little bit different, all the sexy stuff, I guess, something to give us the edge over our competitors. But at the end of the day, if we're not getting those basics right, then none of that matters. We need to get the basics right, and then we can worry about all the sexy stuff later on. So today's talk on warm-ups may not be new. I might not show you any new exercises. I might not have any new thoughts or any new ideas for you, but it might be a nice refresher. I know there's a million ways to get a certain response from an athlete, and maybe some of the exercises you've seen years ago and had forgotten about. It's always nice to refresh some of these things. But hopefully, I guess the main goal of my talk is just to challenge you, to have a think about what you're doing, go back and revisit what you're doing, how you're designing your programs and your warm-up programs in particular. And more importantly, how are you delivering those? Are you coaching them, or are you just standing back and letting the athletes go through the motions with it? And that's the goal today for you, is to challenge those thoughts. So basically, how I'm going to start this is I'm just going to talk about a few examples and a few scenarios that are quite common to me in my coaching experience that I've seen over the years, that I've experienced over the years. And one of the biggest things and ways that I put it is coaches that are late to their own training sessions. And there's no greater frustration than rocking up to a training session and the coach is setting up drills. The athletes are doing their warm-ups to the side and the coach is off setting up drills, or maybe they'll come and talk to me. Oh, how you been? Can we catch up about this player now? You got 12 athletes over there just doing their own thing. There's no quality control, there's no coaching of what they're doing. They're more focused on catching up with me. When I'm talking to other coaches or talking to athletes, some of the things that I hear back are, well, the coach takes care of that. And that's perhaps a common bit of feedback that you guys might receive as well. But if they're talking to me, or if they're setting up drills, they might have written the warm-up, or they might have shown the athletes through it once or twice, but are they actually taking care of it? Are they actually coaching it, maximising it, and delivering it well? Oh, we have a routine that we go through. And that's more common feedback that I'll get. Maybe I've written the routine. Maybe you as strength coaches have developed a really neat little warm-up that you've taken your athletes through before. You might have done it in the gym and then they go and do it out on the field, because if you're like me, you work with 3 or 4 other sports and your time is split between those 4 or 5 different sports, and you can't be at every single training session. So maybe you've actually developed the program, given it to them, and they're doing it by themselves. But then again, how often are you revisiting that? How often are you checking in to make sure that the movements that they're doing and the techniques that they're doing them with are actually of quality and maximising it? I've done a lot of work with individual sports in the past, and let me tell you, and I'm sure you can relate, individual athletes are a whole different species, especially with track and field. One of the common things that they'll tell me is, I know my body, I know what I've got to do to get ready for the session. And the coach of these individual athletes might tell me, they know what they've got to do. They know what they're going to need for the session ahead. You ask the athlete what the session is, and they might not have a clue because the coach hasn't told them. So how do they actually know exactly what they need to do to physically and psychologically prepare for the session that may be ahead? So basically, we're going to go back to basics. And this isn't new. We've all done coaching courses, we've all done our strength and conditioning accreditation through whichever stream you're with. But the science behind it and the rationale behind warm-ups isn't anything new. The warm-up drives the physiological and neuromuscular systems to create compliance between the mind and the muscles, physical, psychological. We know that we've got 2 elements to a warm-up. We know we've got a generic warm-up or a general warm-up, and then we know we need a specific element to it as well to prepare for the actual specifics of the session ahead. So we know that one of the main goals of a general warm-up is to elevate core temperature. Get the core temperature warm, get the muscles warm, get the body prepared. We know that we need to establish a range of motion for the activities that we're going to do ahead. We know we need to psychologically prepare, so being mindful, being focused, and being in the zone. We want to activate muscles, and we want to develop some coordination patterns and tasks that are going to be helpful for the session ahead, as well as generally. So, training principle of specificity comes into play. We know we need to have an exercise or an activity that is specific to prepare the body for the specific activities that are ahead. And the way I describe it is it has to be a crescendo of intensity to a full intensity, 100% effort. So if we're going to do a speed session, we need to start slow, but we need to be hitting 100% efforts before we go into that pure speed session. If we're doing a max effort session, we need a crescendo of intensities, working up in percentage RMs into that 100% that we're looking for. We'll grab the video now. So basically, the science, the rationale behind it isn't new, but the way we deliver it and the way we do it maybe is new. Are we going to play? It's a nice example of a warm-up in the old days. Maybe we see some of this still. I like that. So maybe things have changed a little bit from Maradona's days. Maybe they should have changed a little bit. But yeah, the science, the thoughts, the rationale behind a warm-up hasn't changed, but the way we deliver it has. So we did a bit of an experiment with netball a few years ago. I'm going to put the video on while I explain this, because who's heard of netball? Maybe a few, maybe you guys are the Aussies around. Netball is basically basketball without all the cool stuff. Did you want to press play for me? So basically, netball is basketball without all the cool stuff. You can't dribble the ball, you can't bounce, well, you can bounce the ball, you can't move with the ball. So once you catch the ball, you've got to be static still. And presentation before, the guy that loves ACLs, you come work with netball, we need you. You can't shoot three-pointers, there's no slam dunking, there's certain parts of the court that certain players can't go in, and certain parts that you're only allowed in. There's one player that can only go in that circle at the baseline there. Anyway, we're world champions at it, and we love it, so we put a lot of time and effort into it. So basically, a few years back, we did a little bit of an experiment with the girls that stayed on site with us in Canberra. And you can pause that video now, it goes for quite some time, and that's enough of an example of it. So basically, we wanted to see what the effect of these girls' self-selected warm-ups were on their physical preparedness, readiness for the session ahead. So we looked at heart rate and we tracked it throughout the warm-up. We looked at core temperature. They swallowed those big horse pills and we saw what happened with their core temperature. We got subjective and objective feedback from the coach in terms of the first drill execution, so the number of errors as well as the overall coach's perception of the quality of that drill. And as I mentioned, it was a self-directed warm-up. So on paper, it looked really nice. It looked like what you would consider a typical warm-up. There was elements of aerobic activity, so they did some jogging. There was elements of static stretching as well as dynamic stretching. And there was elements of an increase in intensity, so they did a lot of the running drills, you know, your grapevines, your side to sides, your butt kicks, high knees, things like that. And it finished with some accelerations. So on paper, it looked quite nice. It looked like what you would consider a typical warm-up. But what we saw when we looked at the results from that was quite interesting. We saw that their heart rate ranged from, as a percentage of their max heart rate, ranged from 48 to 62%, with an average in the low to mid 50s. And that range is associated with very light, relaxing, easy, gentle activity. So that's not really where I want my athletes at the start of an intense or a game simulated training session. There was zero change to their core temperature. Nothing, not one iota during that warm-up. The error count from the first drill was pretty extraordinary. They couldn't catch it properly, they couldn't pass it into the positions that they needed, so the ability to perform, the technical skills of the sport needed for that session was quite poor, and the coach called it sloppy. Sloppy and slow were the words that she described it. So we went back and we thought, well, it looks like a reasonable warm-up on paper, but what was going on? So basically, that was a nice example that said, okay, what we write on paper and then letting the athletes go through it. Even though it looks good and even though it ticks all the boxes that we need to tick for a typical warm-up, it's not actually effective in preparing these guys or girls for the session ahead. Another nice example that I give you, and perhaps you can relate to this one, I do the warm-ups for my volleyball boys. So we're on court with them, we do a nice warm-up, a typical warm-up with dynamic stretching, we do the running drills, we do some activation of the glutes and through the posterior shoulder, we do some work building into jumping and landing and hitting, working up to 100%. So all those things that I spoke about before, we incorporated into that. And my coach sits them down for 10 to 15 minutes to tell them what the session's about. And then they wonder why they're getting sore knees and sore shoulders, and the first drill that they do is terrible. The boys are getting ripped by the coach saying, you know, why can't you hit the ball? And it's like, well, you've sat them down for 15 minutes after we did a wonderful warm-up where they were primed and ready to go and executing the skills perfectly. You haven't given them the opportunity to go back and revisit that. So I'm sure some of you can relate to that sort of example as well. So the core temperature one was quite interesting, and the need to actually be warm. So we know from the literature that there's a big range within muscle temperature, and we know also that for every 1 degree change within that muscle temperature, we get some quite significant changes in power, sprint performance and jump performance, 4 to 6%. We also know that for every 1 degree change in temperature, we get some changes to the max isometric strength, and it's about 2% for every 1 degree. We know that by being warmer, you get increased oxygen delivery to the muscles, so we can get things working a bit quicker and easier. We know that there's improved CNS function and nerve transmissions, and that's very, very crucial with our movement patterns and movements. We know that there's improved elasticity in the connective tissues and an increase in your metabolism. So the need to be warm becomes very important. So we're thinking back to our warm-up experiment with our netball girls. I don't know what it's like here, but back home we have our athletes come in the middle of winter or summer, and they strip down as soon as they walk into the gym or to the courts into their tights and singlets. It could be the middle of winter, and I said we get down to -8 some mornings back home, and these girls are coming into these big old halls, and it's cold in there, but they're just like, oh yeah, we'll get warm when we start warming up. Keep them dressed. Something simple that we just didn't even think about, but keeping their pants on, keeping their jumpers on, the hoodies on, and doing the warm-up and keeping that heat within them a little bit easier and a little bit longer. I reckon there's a role to play there within sets as well, as you see the improvement or the changes in your power production and your mass isometric strength. So there's probably merit to putting a jumper or pants back on in between sets if you're going for max power or max strength activities. So we had a guy come and do his PhD with us a few years back now. He was an Irish lad, and he saw that there was a really big gap in the research which looked at movement ability in relation to fitness and performance, and in particular with youth athletes or junior athletes. And because a lot of the athletes that we work with are from that category, it was quite an important bit of research for us. So his paper was titled Power Development and Movement Ability in Junior Athletes. His name was Dr. Ian McEwen, and you can look him up. But basically, from all of his studies and all of his trials, one of the things that really stood out to me was this quote up here. That short, concentrated warm-up drills that are well designed, actually coached, and focused on movement quality can improve movement ability alongside improvements in performance and reduce injury risk. Now, we know that that's perhaps common sense, but it was the magnitude of the results of this that really caused me to go back and have a think about what I'm actually doing and how I'm actually delivering those warm-ups and looking at them as coaching opportunities, not just part of the overall session. So one of the things as well that we know is that perfect practice makes perfect performance, and the need to be focused, the need to be in the moment, mindful of what's going out, using deliberate practice and the principles around that. And the dynamic warm-up is the ideal time to develop and refine movement skills and teach athletes movement precision to solidify the mechanics needed for sports success. And that's something quite important. So the impact, so briefly through the results of the study that made me go back and really think about things. He saw a 40% increase in movement ability. He developed a movement assessment tool called the Athletic Ability Assessment, which is an evolving assessment looking at movement. And he saw a 40% increase in that over the time. He saw a 19% improvement in power in a counter movement jump and drop jump without even training those movements and without doing any additional work on power. This was all about movement quality and movement precision. Power improvements from movement quality. That was interesting for me. 39% reduction in injury risk. So some other take-home messages from that particular piece of work was he saw a need to address functional movement prior to resistance with youth and junior athletes. He saw that the increases in the counter movement jump and in the movement ability occur pretty quickly, and we know this from neuromuscular adaptation. And in less than 3 weeks, you can get quite nice changes. But in the real world, we often get them as young adults. We get them with young adults with very poor movement skills. And I'm quite scared for the future of some of the sports that we have coming through, because we have very, very, very skilled basketball players coming through that can't jump, they can't land, they can't run in a straight line. You know, we have very, very skilled track and field athletes that can run in a straight line quite well, but they just are poor athletes. You ask them to lunge and they're falling over, or you ask them to do a squat and they've got such restrictions through their lower limbs that it's just as an injury waiting to happen. And these guys' careers are going to be much, much, much shorter, and it's quite scary. And with the time restrictions that we get these athletes with, you know, I might get a guy come into me for 2 weeks before he has to be in peak condition to get selected for a national team. Or I might have a guy that comes in for 6 weeks or 6 months leading into a major championships, and I'm expected to get a result with that person. And we all do it. We focus on the big wins or the quick wins. You know, if I restore this guy's strength, he'll be able to withstand the load that he's about to endure from coach. If I get his speed and power qualities up, he'll jump high, he'll hit harder, and the coach will select him because he's looking good. You know, so we focus on those quick wins or those big ticket items, and perhaps we neglect some of their basic fundamental movement skills that are pretty crappy. But I went back and I thought, well, we need to do both. Why can't we do both? We need to do both. And so the warm-ups and this piece of research was like, okay, here's my opportunity to reinvent what I do for my warm-ups, focus on movement ability, but also focus on a few other things as well. One thing I failed to mention is that the results here, this magnitude of results were achieved in 2 15-minute sessions a week and nothing else. These guys didn't enter a gym. They didn't do any additional specific training outside of that. They did 2 15-minute sessions that were well-designed, coached, and focused on movement ability. That is pretty incredible. So I get my guys for 3 or 4 gym sessions a week. So there's 3 or 4 coaching opportunities that I have to make a difference. If I have the ability to influence and work with my coach and get on court and start to work with the warm-ups as part of an integrated and collaborative approach there, my volleyballers are on court 10 to 12 times a week. Add that to what they're in the gym, and that's 16 sessions a week that I can make an impact, 16 additional coaching opportunities. You do the maths around the numbers of that. If you get 10 to 15 minutes for those sessions, that's 2 to 4 hours a week of extra coaching opportunity that you can make a difference to these kids' foundation movement skills. You can improve their power. You can decrease their injury risk. So that's pretty incredible when you break it down like that. So, I'm stealing Martin Boucher's terminology here, and I apologise for that. But I like acronyms, they make me remember things, and they're easy. In a perfect world, we'd have as much time as we need to do all the movement foundations that we want in a warm-up. We could activate, we could stimulate, we could mobilize, we could do everything we need. We could have 10 to 15 minutes 10 times a week with our athletes, and we can make some really nice changes. But in the real world, we may not get that. We might get the approval to come out on the field and start doing warm-ups with our athletes, and then coach appears and he said, oh, you only got 5 minutes with them today because we need to do this, this, and this. Or he changes training. Oh, they're a bit fatigued today, so we're not going to do gym for the rest of the week. So then you're missing 2 or 3 sessions after that. Or he might change training, or he might make them run more at the end of training because they've stuffed up a few drills, and he's like, well, we're going to punish them with physical activity. So, irrespective of all the limitations, of all the challenges, this is my default. If I've got elements of mobility, elements of activation, and elements to stimulate, then I'm getting my athletes as well prepared given the limitations and given those challenges that I can. So mobilize the area to enhance movement capacity. Activate the supporting musculature and the movement patterns. Stimulate the neural system to maximize the session ahead. So this is the framework that I always default back to. The way I describe it and the way I think about it is it's a bit like a pseudo-conjugate style of warm-up. All right, hitting multiple systems within the one session, within the 1 week to achieve a better and more long-lasting result. So depending on the session ahead, and this is where the collaboration with your coach and the planning of your own sessions becomes very important, the varying percentages of each of the mobility, activation, stimulation will vary based on that session ahead. If we've got a speed session, then we'll focus a little bit more attention on activation, mobility, and that crescendo of activities into the full 100% efforts. If we're doing a technical session out on the court or out on the field, then we might do a little bit more on stimulation, getting coordination, getting talking, communication, teamwork happening a bit more. So that's the way I describe it. It's a pseudo-conjugate style of warming up. So they're not in isolation, or they're not sequential. You don't have to mobilize to activate, to stimulate. There's elements and it's intertwined by design. I know there's a lot of debate and a lot of, I don't know if it's argument, but there's two sides of the fence. Do you train movements or do you train muscles? At the end of the day, you need to tell the muscle how to work. You need to activate it to perform the movement optimally, so you need to do both. It's hand in hand. That's my theory, and that's the way I am. So mobility, what is mobility? We've got the classical definition up there. It's the ability to move fluidly through a range of movement without physical hindrance. In relation to what we're trying to get from our athletes, can the athlete get in the required positions for their sport? Can they get their arm in the required position to throw a javelin? Things like that. You ask any of the athletes that come through my door in one of the early sessions that I've got with them what they think mobility is, and the first thing they'll tell me is it's got to do with a foam roller. You know, I'm mobilizing by going and laying on the foam roller. That's what 99% of them will tell me. 99% of them will use it wrongly too. So mobility is more than foam rolling, and these are just a sample of some of my, I guess, my favorite mobility activities, and everything's begged, stolen or borrowed in this industry, so a lot of this comes from Cressy's work and Pavel Satsulin's work with his relax into stretch. Ooh. All right. So one of the things I always do is I start with the glutes. All right? Working from the midline, loosening up through the glutes and the hips facilitates much greater movement down through the lower limbs and also allows much easier movement up through the upper limbs as well. So that's one of the things I always do, start with the glutes in the middle. Going from slow to fast, talking about that crescendo and intensity, going from isolated-ish movements to more complex movements, and actually coaching and correcting the movements as they go through. So this is where we get a bit touchy-feely, all right? Teaching the athletes to feel, all right? Teaching them to feel themselves when they come to the gym. Probably can't say that, but that's what we do. I want them to explore, and I want them to play, and I will direct their attention to how something should feel when we're talking about mobility work. You should feel a lengthening through here, you should feel stretch through here, and getting them to relay back to me if they can, if they can't. If they can't, that's fine. Everyone's unique. Everyone will feel tension and feel a stretch in a different spot, but actually getting them to tune in to what they feel, because we don't just want robotic athletes that mimic what we tell them to do. We want them to be able to adjust things and have that kinesthetic insight and feedback to give us more insight into their performance to help them better. So isolated movements are good, but combining movements together and chaining and sequencing them and progressing them is quite important too. So I think we've already seen one where she's like hugged a knee, gone into an arabesque, into a lunge, some rotation. So not only are we working on the mobility of those areas, we're starting to activate some of those movement patterns. So like I said, they're not in isolation, they're intertwined together, and this is a really nice way to do it. Sounds a bit crazy outside there. Posture. Posture is something that is getting worse and worse with the athletes that come in. We know that society is very frontal. Their computers, they're reading, they're sitting. Trying to get them to come into the gym, get into an optimal position that I can load up to get strength and power changes is becoming harder and harder. So getting them to focus on their posture with all of these movements is very, very important. So activation, the communication between the brain and the muscle units. And this is one of my favorite ones just here. I call it the rear delt sit-up. I don't know what it's really called. But basically just driving the elbows and stimulating and getting all those posterior shoulder muscles to wake up. I love to use that before bench sessions and before any other overhead upper body sessions. So like I said, activate the muscles as well as the movement patterns. All right? They work hand in hand and they both need to be done. Areas that I commonly activate before sessions, and it's not through all sessions, it's specific to the session ahead here. The glutes again, the shoulders, the trunk, and the foot intrinsic. And the lecture going on next door, I believe, is about foot intrinsic. So barefoot warm-ups. Always introducing an element of a barefoot activity a few times a week. Doesn't have to be all week, doesn't have to be every session, but a few times a week just to get that integrity within the foot, because we know that it's crucial for effective force transfer with all our ambulance sports and our running and jumping based sports, to have that integrity within the foot. Wowee, it's coming down out there. So activating movement patterns, and we saw in some of the mobility video before that we've already started looking at the lunging patterns. All right? Adding elements or different bits of equipment such as a medicine ball for an overhead activation, getting them to be tight and tall, opening up through the chest, starting to address that poor posture by forcing them up into an overhead position. Really nice ways to activate an overhead position before we start to load it with a barbell, with a dumbbell, with anything heavier. Squatting, pushing and pulling, depending on the session ahead as to what you need to focus your attentions on. But more importantly, I guess, and more specifically, looking at jumping and landing, and looking at hopping patterns as well as that, double leg, single leg landings, and looking at running. So if you're asking them to jump, land, change direction, perform agility-based movements or run, then you need to activate those sequences within your warm-up so it's not a shock to the body or to the system once they get there. They can draw on those movement patterns much quicker and easier. And she's just going to finish off with some hops here. And some landings. So we use altitude landings quite a lot, and you can make some really nice progressions with these. I like these as a specific training focus after a weekend of tournaments or competitions to retrain that movement pattern, as we know that once athletes get on the court or get on the field, they're going to revert back to their natural patterns anyway, and it's very hard to make that change. So getting in and correcting to more of a correct pattern that first session back and resetting the body is quite a nice method as well. Cool. So stimulating the system. So we find that this is quite often overlooked, and this makes all the difference if you're doing a game-based session or a technical-based session between starting slow. And commentators love that, and coaches love that. Oh, we start slow. We're known for being slow starters, or we come good at the end of the first set or the end of the first quarter, whatever it may be. But you can really easily fix that by preparing the athletes better and actually challenging their system with a stimulating activity, challenging their coordination, challenging their decision making, their reaction time, getting them to start those other things that are involved in a team sport or in a team sport, communicating with each other, starting to call for plays, starting to call for the ball, teamwork, working together to get a common goal. A lot of these activities are really fun. A lot of the other stuff is really boring, and it's hard to keep the athletes on task and motivated and focused to get that quality. But this stuff they love, because it is a challenge. You can make it a competition, and it can be a really fun experience and a nice way to bring together the end of that warm-up and start a technical session with your coach on the field or on the court, or a really high intensity session in the gym or on the field. So some examples that I've used, and I don't have any video, I apologise for that. Things like gladiator challenges, like we've set up a gauntlet on the track where we've got boxes to go under, we've got people smacking people with foam rollers, you've got to learn to dodge, get away, get under, get over, get around, just to challenge them, get some different movement patterns happening, get them to react to things, get them to talk to each other, get a bit of trash talk happening, just a bit of frivolity and prepared for the session ahead. The little picture I've got up there is a game I call tail tag. You can call it whatever you want. Basically put a little small training tail in the back of the pants, set out a square, maybe as big as this stage, have 4 or 5 people in that square. They're running around trying to get the tags off each other. So you've got to try and get as many tags as you can. You're changing direction, you're reacting to things, you're dodging things, you're starting trash talking again. It's all about creating that environment, creating that culture for the session ahead. So I will talk about a couple of the sexy and funky things that we're playing with. I'm a big fan of occlusion cuff training, blood flow restriction, katsu, whatever you want to call it over here. And the way I'm using it with warm-ups at the moment is looking at a potentiation effect. And we think that happens through an increased calcium responsiveness. So I've been trialing some things in a static and a light, low intensity dynamic environment. So basically we've got double cuffs on the legs and we're just going to sit there for 3 to 5 minutes. Or we've got them on the arms, same thing, or we're going to do a low speed treadmill walk for again 3 to 5 minutes, or we're going to get on the bike or on the arm grinder with the cuffs on the specific parts of the body again. So we don't know what we're going to see here. We don't know whether it's going to work or whether it's not going to work. And if anybody's doing any of this stuff, I would love to have a chat with you over the next couple of days, because it's something that I'm really intrigued in. We use it a little bit with hypertrophy as well in terms of rehab, and it's just something that's kind of nice new 1%er kind of thing that we're looking into at the moment. One of the other things, and I've called it modern potentiation as well, is in stochastic resonance. And we had Professor Schmidt-Blacker come out to Australia a few years ago now and introduce us to this concept. And basically, if you haven't heard about it, it's a random process added to a subthreshold stimulus with the goal to enhance sensory information processing and perception. So potentiation effect works on the reflex system, and the way it differs from a traditional vibration plate is through a randomized process. You know, it's not predictable, it's not the same in oscillations, it's a randomized process. I said I worked a lot with Paralympic athletes and para-athletes, and I've read just one study. There's not too many studies out there on Paralympic athletes, and you delve into the medical world and I get lost in some of the terminology there. But with my cerebral palsy athletes, and I've got one athlete with ataxia, what we're seeing, and it's supported by the literature, is we get an immediate positive effect on balance, on proprioception, and on their gait. I got a guy that uses a walking stick to get around in the gym, to get around in everyday life, and he can drop that stick and walk to his activities following a few short efforts on the stochastic resonance machine. What they say in the literature as well is that there's an improvement in speech. Now, I haven't seen that with him in particular yet, but what is very exciting is they say in this one article that the effects are acute, but they also have long-term effects. So you're improving the quality of life for these guys as well as the acute effects. And I find that really, really interesting, and something that, you know, we quite often forget. Our athletes are commodities, but they're humans as well. There's a life after sport, and some of these interventions, we can help their quality of life for that time after sport. So putting it all together, and as I said, there's a million ways to skin a cat, there's a million exercises to get the same result. This is just a couple of examples, one example from the gym, one example from on the field that I've used and that I do use, and it's just the way I do it. You'll customize it to your own environment, to your own conditions, and to your own athletes, and working within those limitations and challenges that you may have. So, a light but effective aerobic warm-up, potentially with the cuff, if I've got an individual athlete, because we don't have cuffs for everyone. So looking at the group size and working out what's appropriate and what's not, but clothed, you know, really simply, tracksuit pants on, hoodie on, a light, effective aerobic warm-up. Going into some of those mobility exercises, and as I said, start with the glutes and work from there. So some of the activities I like, 90-90s, which is the cross-legged one we saw in the video, and the Cossack lunges if you've got access to hurdles, hurdle mobility walks, stepping over, stepping under, doing rotations as well. Moving to thoracic mobility, chest openers, and then into some of those more advanced but still basic mobility activities such as your inchworms, your basic Spider-Mans, your prisoner squats. But as I mentioned a few times, increasing the range of motion as you go through that. So starting very shallow and then working down to fuller ranges as you go. Some activation work and a couple of examples for the glutes there, the crab walks, I'm sure you've seen them, big jump band or therabands around the ankles and knees, and fire hydrants, which is basically a 4-point kneel, leg out to the side like a dog at a fire hydrant. Some running drills, so getting up and active a little bit again, and they're just your basic running drills that anyone would do, but working on the quality of them, the quality of the foot contact, and making sure that everything is activated and aggressive are the words that I use there. Progressing some of the mobility work, so you saw the Spider-Mans that involve the elbow touch, the trunk rotations, increasing and advancing those things as you go through the warm-up. Integrating some extra activities and some extra exercise equipment such as the medicine balls. And going back again to some activation from the upper body for scapular push-ups into a full push-up, and challenging them by staggering their hands and changing the placement there. Then some optional extras in terms of stimulation, depending on your group, depending on your athletes, depending on your session. Some single leg balance with the medicine ball throws can be to a partner, can be to a wall, can be overhead to the side, can be trying to knock your partner off balance, bouncing the ball to them. This is where you start to get creative and you start to have a bit of fun. If you've got a team, you can do a tug of war challenge. If you've got the big battle ropes handy, that's really, really good fun. And maybe there's a potentiating effect if you're doing a max isometric or a max contraction with that, maybe. The obstacle course I spoke about earlier, the gladiator gauntlet, or just having different heights of boxes and starting to get a bit more of a dynamic and varied element into the warm-up as well. So on the field or on the court, a barefoot element, getting the foot intrinsics to switch on and to be woken up, ready for the session ahead. Walking on toes, walking on heels, walking on the outside, walking on the inside, and then probably even progressing through the rest of the warm-up. We're safe and we're familiar with the shoes off as well. Again, a light, effective aerobic element. I love skipping. I think it's the most underutilized activity in terms of warm-up, but also jump training and foot activation and aggressive foot strike against the ground. Bike riding or running. Optional static stretch. So, some individuals are very, very traditional, very superstitious in what they want as part of their warm-up. You've got to respect that. If you try and change it, you'll just keep butting heads and you won't get a result. So you have to give a bit to get a bit. So static stretching, we know that there's an element of decrease in power, but we also know that if you back it up with a dynamic element or a sport-specific element, it kind of negates that benefit these days. So allowing time for that individual superstitious static stretch, or they might have a particular favourite stretch they want to do. Some activation work, and in particular the knee to wall stretch that you would have seen my lovely model do, where she was banging her knee against the wall. Really, really important with running, with jumping, with landing. If you've got jammed up ankles, you're going to land in a crappy position, the force is going to transfer through your knees, through your back. You need to get that sorted before you start that session. Prisoner squats, one of my favourites, increasing the range, some walking lunges, and if you've got a team environment, you can start to put the ball and the equipment in much, much earlier. Get people walking with lunges, throwing the ball back and forth. Dynamic stretches, there's a million of them. I just put dynamic stretches 1, dynamic stretches 2 in there because there's a million of them and we all know them, and we all choose ones that are specific to our sport and to our athletes. Some ankle running, some running drills, some low, mid, high knees, some bouncing, working on footwork, that aggressive foot strike, that good contact with the ground, that maximal force transfer. And then looking at some 2-line drills. And one thing I really like to do, if we've got a team sport that uses a ball in particular, get half the team facing each other and the other half of the team facing them. 1 or 2 balls or whatever you want, 3 or 4 balls, and just get them to do their general warm-up drills with their running patterns. So your side to sides, your grapevines, where they're passing that ball up and down the line. And if you come from footy background, I guess it's kind of like an old school football warm-up drill where you're doing things, passing the ball down the line and up the line. But for a lot of sports, that's quite novel and new. And finishing off with a stimulating game. So the tail tag one, where you got the towel down the back of the shorts, or something simple like keepies off. So we've had like, I don't know if you call it handball over here with a tennis ball, and you've got the squares on the ground and you're hitting the tennis ball, or hand tennis, something like that. That's a really good one if you've got a sport like tennis or badminton or squash where they've got to have that hand-eye coordination working really well. It's a bit of fun, and you can have like a World Series or a challenge competition from there. With all this though, like I said at the start, you can have the best thing written down. It can look like a really effective and good warm-up. But it's actually how you as coaches deliver it that's going to make the difference, and actually being there and actually coaching it, not just letting them go through the motions while you catch up with the coach, or while you're setting up drills or setting up a circuit or setting up activities. It's important that you're as mindful as you want your athletes, that you're not letting poor execution of skill go through, that you're correcting it, and that you're actually maximising these opportunities, because they can be very significant. So as I said at the start, your challenge, have a look at what you currently deliver. Have a look and see if there's ways that you can improve it. As I said, there may not have been anything new in terms of the exercises or the information that I've presented to you today. But maybe it's a nice refresher to go, okay, I haven't seen that in years. Maybe I can start to build some things like that back in. Have a look at what other opportunities you might have within the week to really maximise movement refinement, and think about those additional coaching opportunities that you have. Is there a way that you can influence the coach to be able to be more involved in your court sessions or your field sessions? And make sure you coach the crap out of it, all right? Be there, correct it. That's the biggest thing, actually coaching it and delivering it. So, thank you very much for your attention. I know it's been a long day, and thank you.